Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Human Biology in the Psychology Unit, and this is Part 3. Well, we left off in Part 2 talking about the cerebrum, which is the largest and most complex part of the brain. It is responsible for most of our complex mental activities, and it is divided into two hemispheres. So let's talk about another structure, which is actually the structure that connects the left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum. It's called the corpus callosum. Okay, so the corpus callosum is what connects the right and left hemispheres, and it will be a bridge between them. The cerebral cortex is the cerebrum's outer layer of neural tissue, and each hemisphere is separated into 4 folds or lobes. So you have your cerebrum, and then we know from other things that a cortex is on the outside, and there's my cat. So the cerebral cortex is the outside layer of the cerebrum, the part that goes around most of your brain. So we're going to draw a simplified view of this. It doesn't have to be beautiful, but draw the outline of the cerebrum, and then there are 4 folds or lobes of the cerebral cortex, or just that outside of the cerebrum. So the front one is called the frontal lobe, and it takes up most of the front. And then the back one is called the occipital lobe, makes up the back. And then right in front here is the temporal lobe. And then between all of them is the parietal lobe. And each one of these lobes has its own job, and we'll talk about each one. So the first one we're going to talk about is we're going to start all the way in the back, and that is the occipital lobe, and it receives and processes information related to sight. So information from your eyes goes in and goes all the way back to the back of the brain where it gets processed. The second lobe of the cerebral cortex we're going to talk about is the parietal lobe, and that receives and processes body information. So incoming sensory information about where your body is and what it's feeling, touch, pressure, temperature, and pain is going to be processed by the parietal lobe, which is up here, kind of in the top. And then another one is the temporal lobe, which processes sound and speech information and helps understand language and processes auditory memories and auditory emotions, like the feeling you get when you hear that song that you love. So the temporal lobe would be working with other parts of the brain, like the limbic system and the thalamus and the hippocampus, to process auditory memories and the auditory portion of emotions. So looking up here, the temporal lobe is here, kind of like above the ear, where you might expect it. And then coming down, our fourth one is the frontal lobe, which is involved in speaking, planning, abstract thinking, judging, imagining, problem solving, and many aspects of your personality. So this is involved in a lot. We'll take a look at it, and it is the front part, hence the name frontal lobe of your cerebral cortex. So again, it's involved in speaking. So right now I am speaking to you and my frontal lobe is involved. And planning. So when I'm planning what I'm going to be saying about the frontal lobe is involved. Abstract thinking. So perhaps one of the reasons you're watching this video is to get a good grade, and grades are a very abstract thought. They are not a concrete thing you can hold in your hand. Judging. So if you decide something is good or something is bad, you're going to be using your frontal lobe. Also imagining. Perhaps you are imagining what you would be doing if you were at school or at practice or whatever. if you were not social distancing, and that involves your frontal lobe because you are not doing it at this exact moment with your body. So that is a higher level ability. Problem solving. So maybe you are a bit worried about how you're going to get all your stuff done, and so you're going to have to come up with, okay, what do I do first? What do I do second? What do I do? And that is problem solving. Your frontal lobe is also involved in aspects of your personality. So, for example, do you like it when things are planned out, or do you just do whatever is next in your head? So the frontal lobe is divided into two different sections. The motor cortex, which is involved in planning and control and the execution of voluntary movement. So if I told you to raise your hand, then you would have to decide that you're going to raise your right hand, which is opposite on the video, and then you would have to control and execute that, and your motor cortex is involved with all of that. Also, you have a prefrontal cortex, which is the front of the frontal lobe, and this is associated with planning complex behavior, decision making, and moderating social behavior, as well as executive functioning. And we're going to talk a little bit about what executive functions are. Okay, so executive functions relate to abilities to differentiate among conflicting thoughts, like perhaps I really want to check TikTok versus I want to get this video done. Determining good and bad, better and best. So perhaps you could say, well, that was a good thing to do, or that was a bad thing to do, and then that was an even better thing to do. And same and different. So putting things in categories, how are they the same or how are they different, comparing and contrasting. We're using a lot of executive functioning in science. The future consequences of current activities. So for example, you could say, well, if I don't do any of my homework, what will be the future consequence of that? And that would be using your prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe, and that would be an executive function. So perhaps you are working towards a defined goal. So maybe you said, I would like to be better at shooting free throws. So maybe I'm going to work on free throw shooting for 15 minutes a day. That's working towards a defined goal. The prediction of outcomes. So you could predict that if you do work on shooting basketball 15 minutes a day, that you would get better at it and you get better at your free throws. So expectations based on action. This one is pretty similar to prediction of outcomes. So let's talk about social control, which is the ability to suppress urges that, if not suppressed, could lead to socially unacceptable outcomes. Perhaps you are in Walmart and you see someone who's wearing a really ugly outfit. So instead of saying really loudly so that everyone can hear, oh my goodness, that outfit is so horrible. How could that person be wearing it? You could think that in your head and not say it out loud, because that would be socially unacceptable to be rude to someone you don't know, or even to someone you do know. So as you can see, your prefrontal cortex and your frontal lobe both have very many very important functions, and executive functions are really important. They can help us be more successful in our lives, and it's important for everybody, myself included, to kind of hone up those executive functions, kind of working on goals and suppressing your immediate needs to kind of working on something that you want even more. So perhaps I like the endorphin rush after I go running, but at this moment I really want to eat like a pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. So the executive functions would be involved in postponing the pint of ice cream, going running, and then getting that ultimate goal of that endorphin rush from going running. So another thing I want to talk about are mirror neurons, which are found in your psychology binder on page 79 to 80. And those are neurons in the frontal lobe, which are fired when performing an action or when watching someone else do that action. These mirror neurons were discovered actually by accident in Italy in the 1990s. They were doing a study with some monkeys, and they had their brains hooked up, and they were watching what happened in what their brain activity was when they picked up maybe like a banana or a ball, and then a human on the team picked up a ball, and the monkey's neurons fired just like when the monkey had picked up the ball. So the neurons in the frontal lobe fire when you perform an action or when they watch someone else do that action. So that's pretty cool, and it has quite a few implications. So these are important in learning a new task. Perhaps there's a new basketball drill and you watch somebody do that, and then you're able to do that yourself. It makes it easier for you to learn that. Empathy. So if you see someone who's sad and perhaps you feel a little sad, that is empathy, and you're better able to figure out what would it feel like if I were in their shoes. And then the complex social emotional situations of everyday humans, where we have to communicate with people, understand where they're coming from, figure out what they're trying to say, read their body language. So there's just a lot that's going on in our everyday interactions with people. And mirror neurons help us with those. So your book also goes over neuroplasticity, and it has nothing to do with plastic. It's just the verb. Things that are plastic are flexible. And adult brains are thought to be more flexible than previously thought. So it's not that your brain stops when you're like 10 and it can't do anything beyond what you learned then. So experience will change brain structures actually. And how do we know that? So for example, if you practice juggling every day for 3 months, the visual and motor areas of your brain would be structurally different. There would be a physical difference in your brain in those areas that you had strengthened by practicing juggling every day. And we know this because a damaged brain can rewire. For example, the occipital lobe, which we know from what we just learned is back here, is involved with processing sight. And in some blind people, this part of the brain is recruited to help with verbal processing. Also, people who have strokes and have parts of their brains are damaged, they can teach other parts of their brain to do that same task. Perhaps learn to read or learn to speak again. Your book also goes over right brain and left brain hemispheres. So certain areas of the brain are specialized to interpret different types of information. For example, the production of speech in your Broca's area in the left hemisphere, or spatial processing in the right hemisphere. So there are certain parts of the brain which may be on the left or right hemispheres that specialize in different activities. However, this does not mean that like artsy people are right brain dominant or mathematical people are left brain dominant. That is just bad science. So just because there are parts of the right hemisphere of your brain that's important for spatial processing doesn't mean if you are good at spatial processing, you are right brain dominant. Again, that is a thought that a lot of people have, and it was based on bad science, so now you're smarter than a lot of other people. Okay, now we've learned all the parts of the brain that we're going to focus on, and in the next section, we're going to practice learning those different parts. All right, I will see you then. Bye.